Since South Park premiered in 1997, they've lampooned their fair share of presidents and presidential candidates. The show began during the Clinton administration and has survived to see at least 7 presidential elections, and typically they aren't afraid to utilize these real-life politicians in their narratives and satire. But this year, Matt and Trey have opted to skip the presidential election cycle entirely, and while there are many reasons they're doing this, one that they've cited is that they are just tired of covering Donald Trump on the show. This has caused a lot of anger on both sides of the political aisle, with people claiming everything from lack of creativity, straight up cowardice, or even deep state conspiracies as the culprit for this decision. And people's reaction to this had me wondering, are people's perception of how South Park has historically handled presidents and presidential candidates accurate? So today, I want to go through how South Park has parodied each and every presidential administration during its long lifespan and determine what exactly their motivations seem to be when lambasting these politicians. And hey, while you're here, maybe consider subscribing. I cover lots of South Park topics as well as other adult animated shows, so check it out if you're interested. Okay, so I will be going through each president section by section soon, but before we start here, let's talk about this decision to sit out the 2024 election cycle. Like I mentioned, people's reaction to South Park skipping out has been very volatile and opinions have varied wildly. Some people think that they're trying to help Trump, some people think they're trying to harm his chances, and other very smart people think there's some deep state media control mandate not to make fun of Biden or Harris, and that Matt and Trey, of all people, would fall in line with this mandate. Yes, some people believe that the same Matt and Trey who fought tooth and nail to try and show an image of Muhammad on TV despite attempts to be censored by terrorist threats would simply comply if told they cannot make fun of a certain candidate. Just very intelligent takes coming in. And I think some of this anger and conspiracy-laden thinking stems from what is maybe a more recent misperception of exactly what motivates Matt and Trey when they're using political candidates or presidents in their episode narratives. Obviously, a lot of this is because of how they approach Trump differently than previous presidents or candidates, and obviously there's also the fact that they haven't showcased Joe Biden and all during his tenure as president. But I think all of these things have pretty reasonable explanations when you really just look at the show's history and tendencies. So first, let's go back to 1998.
And he assured me that I have a very large penis.
Bill Clinton's South Park debut came in 1998's episode Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, the follow-up to the season 1 finale cliffhanger. And the characterization they set for Bill in this one is basically the main gimmick that they stuck with for nearly every single Bill Clinton appearance after this, down to his most recent back in season 20, and that focus is his sexual deviancy. In this episode, Leanne Cartman is reeling from the events of the previous finale, where Cartman was desperately searching for an answer to who his father is. Leanne is basically wondering if she's even fit to be a mother, and so she basically sleeps her way to the White House in an attempt to change abortion laws.
Well, okay, Mrs. Cartman, I'll legalize 40th trimester abortions for you.
Of course, as it turned out, Leanne mixed up abortion and adoption, but the characterization of Clinton here is pretty clear. His focus is sexual promiscuity over his own principles. 40th trimester abortion is a pretty funny way to describe killing an 8-year-old boy. And I think this characterization is very understandable if you know anything about Clinton's tenure as president. The biggest scandal being about his 18-month sexual relationship with 22-year-old intern Monica Lewinsky, for which Clinton was impeached. Though not every Clinton appearance focused on this aspect of his character, but most of them did. Clinton's next appearance was in South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, where he finds himself at the center of the Terrence and Phillip Asses of Fire-driven censorship conflict between Canada and the United States.
My fellow Americans, at 5 a.m. today, a day which will live in infamy, the Canadians have bombed the Baldwins.
The South Park movie doesn't focus much on the aforementioned sexual promiscuity, but it certainly didn't make him look like a particularly strong or effective leader. He basically kowtows to Sheila Broflovsky's wishes, she's appointed as the United States Secretary of Offense, and they declare war on Canada. This actually leads to a ground troop invasion of the United States from Canada, which is pretty insane South Park lore, all things considered. Clinton's next appearance was in Season 3's Chinpokomon. In this one, Japan is using the Chinpokomon craze to install tons of military bases within the United States for an incredibly obvious and telegraphed attempt to bomb Pearl Harbor again, this time using American children as the fighter pilots. And to get away with this, the Japanese appeal to Clinton's ego through his sexual deviancy.
And he assured me that I have a very large penis. He said it was mammoth, dinosauric.
Granted, almost every dude in this entire episode was convinced the exact same way Clinton was, but this aligns with their prior characterization of Clinton really well. As does Clinton's final appearance during his own tenure as president in season 3's The Red Badge of Gayness, in which Cartman leads a group of Confederate Army reenactors to march on Washington in order to have the results of the Civil War retroactively overturned. And how is Cartman gonna pull this off, might you ask?
If you do not meet our demands, we will be forced to show the videotapes we have of you with Marissa Tomei.
Oh, dear God.
As it turns out, Cartman entirely made this threat up, and yet it turned out to be true. Bill Clinton was literally willing to declare the Confederacy the victors of the Civil War and allow their secession from the United States so that a videotape of himself and Marissa Tomei wouldn't be leaked. Stan and Kyle end up stopping all of this from happening by reenacting Abe Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and Clinton then tries to thank them personally.
Boys, as President of the United States, I want to commend you for stopping the rebel uprising.
Don't touch me.
As mentioned, this was Clinton's final appearance before the 2000 election. However, it wasn't Clinton's final appearance in the series. He actually appeared again 11 years later in the episode Sexual Healing, depicted as one of the many celebrity sex addicts who are going through therapy to try and fix their addiction. So, even another decade after his term as president, South Park was still pretty intent on harping on that specific angle of his characterization. And Clinton is shown to be pretty vulgar and gross throughout this episode. In fact, he says some stuff that I'm not even sure I can show in this video, so I won't. But essentially, the group they were a part of was more interested in teaching people how not to get caught in their bad behavior, not in changing their behavior altogether.
We have to take responsibility for our actions.
What the are you talking about?
This episode goes in a lot of wild places. It basically shows all of the men in the group and government blaming an infected alien for everybody's issues with sex addiction. The whole idea here being that nobody wants to accept personal responsibility or admit that their celebrity status allows them more opportunities to be promiscuous and that they simply don't have the willpower to say no. And so they try and get out of any culpability by claiming they're cured after they kill this quote-unquote alien.
Look, the sex addiction. It's leaving my body.
You have to admit, they are consistent when it comes to old Bill, even down to his final appearance in the 2016 post-election episode, titled Oh Geez. Obviously, we'll talk a lot more about this one later, but they had clearly expected Hillary to win the 2016 election, and therefore, we're going to make the subplot of this one about Bill Clinton being the first ever first gentleman. They had to pivot, and did so relatively clumsily.
Hi, kids. I'm Bill Clinton, and I was almost the first gentleman in America. Thank you.
The entire bit here was that they were going to play on the term first gentleman by having Bill promote his own gentleman's club. A pretty funny play on words, pretty consistent characterization with old Billy once again, though this time they included another sexually devious Bill.
I'm Bill, and I'm Bill, and together we're Bill and Bill.
Honestly, Clinton also sort of gets a little bit of an arc completion in this episode, one that's really in line with what they were teaching him at Sexual Healing, but also is sort of the culmination of his years of infidelity. Clinton basically owns up to his actions and how they affected his wife for all of those years.
I've done things my whole life that gradually broke her spirit.
And he basically tells Butters that they all have to fall in line or else they are doomed. This is all tied into the entire troll Trey story in season 20, which was poised to reveal everyone's internet history and cause havoc for trolls, basically revealing everyone's true self to their families and loved ones. But it actually sort of works as this wrap-up to Bill's continued appearances in South Park. But even all of these years later, South Park was just very committed to this specific comedic angle with Bill Clinton. And I really think that is the thing to take away. South Park has always been focused on comedy. They found an angle with Bill that they thought was funny, and they found ways to naturally implement that into stories across their run of the series. Obviously, that angle was rooted in something real, and showed that they did not have much respect for him as a president, but it was also exaggerated in a way that prioritized the comedy and their narratives. And I think this is important to keep in mind looking at the other candidates as well. So let's say goodbye to old Bill as we move on.
Thanks a lot, Bill Clinton. Yeah, thanks, Dick.
Before we move on to the next president, I think we need to do a little tangent here for just the 2000 election in general. Obviously, this was an outrageously close election, riddled with controversy and recounts. South Park parodied this in the episode Trapper Keeper with the kindergarten class presidential election, pitting Fillmore against Ike. It is mostly a really fun episode that did a really good job creating parallels to the election recount issues with aspects of the kindergarten class. One classmate, Flora, couldn't make up her mind, alluding to Florida's race that was nearly too close to call. They had to wait until the absent kid came in to vote, paralleling the absentee votes that they were waiting on, and largely, they sort of made fun of the bureaucracy and refusals to concede. They even went off on the Hollywood elite trying to pipe up about the Florida results in defense of Middle America.
People like you preach tolerance and open-mindedness all the time, but when it comes to Middle America, you think we're all evil and stupid country yokels who need your political enlightenment.
This episode was made just about a week after the election, and honestly, while they did fit in a lot of the recount controversies that at the time definitely felt kind of silly, looking back, that whole process in Florida was a real mess. They made fun of some of these things in a really dismissive way.
I think the ballots were misleading. Some kids didn't understand who they were voting for.
There's a box next to Fillmore's name and a box next to Ike's. What's not to understand?
This is a reference to the butterfly ballots in Palm Beach County. If you look at them closely, you can see that some candidates are on the left and some are on the right, and while Al Gore is the second candidate you would read on the ballot, he's actually the third hole you would punch. And there really were an unusually large number of votes in that county for Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan, who was the second hole punch, enough to question if people understood the ballot properly. Buchanan himself even acknowledged this reality. In fact, 19,000 ballots were discounted because they were marked too many times, which was up from 3,000 in the prior election, and according to some studies, this specifically cost Gore the election. We obviously will never know for sure. There were many other controversies within the recount dilemma as well. It's an entire rabbit hole if you're interested. And I think at the time, this sort of prolonged election controversy had never really been experienced, and so people were understandably sort of fed up with the process almost immediately, just wanting an answer more than anything. And I think South Park's episode definitely expressed this sentiment as well, feeling like the ongoing recount was making things more divisive. Hell, even Al Gore conceding is proof that everyone wanted to just move forward, but it's certainly an insane event in election history that perhaps should have been given more thorough attention, not less. And funny enough, the 2000 election also directly affected one of Matt and Trey's other projects, what would become a sitcom called That's My Bush. The entire premise of That's My Bush is, what if there was a stereotypical, borderline unfunny old family sitcom that was centered on the President of the United States? Bush was the bumbling patriarch constantly getting into trouble based on his gig as president. He had a largely unsatisfied wife, a sarcastic and fed up maid, an annoying neighbor who just pops in randomly.
Hey George, it's your favorite neighbor.
Honestly, it's a fun premise, but Matt and Trey began developing this as a series called Everybody Loves Al, expecting that he would be the next president, with the project being pushed back during the whole election limbo. So yeah, Matt and Trey's false expectations of the election outcome would actually bite them in the ass 2 different times in their career. And so when we get to George W., we'll talk a bit about this show as well, but before we get to him, I think we actually have to also cover the 2000 presidential loser, Al Gore, because even though he appears in fewer episodes, he might actually have more screen time than George W. Bush over the course of South Park's history. I am super serial about that.
Thank you, Al Gore. You're super awesome.
Al Gore is one of the most interesting examples of South Park's presidential parody tendencies. Obviously, he never became president, but the way in which he is portrayed in the show is very different than other politicians or presidential candidates. Well, it was later at least. His first appearance was in season 3's The Red Badge of Gayness as Clinton's vice president.
I'm so glad I don't have your job.
But then, 7 years later, well after the 2000 presidential campaign, season 10 saw the release of Man Bear Pig. This was in the midst of Gore's ongoing attempts to bring attention to climate change with his documentary An Inconvenient Truth, and at the time, South Park's take was very dismissive and critical of Gore's campaign. And so, in their episode, they showed Gore trying to bring attention to a threat that was just obviously fake nonsense.
I'm talking, of course, about Man Bear Pig.
So I think the comedic idea here is very funny personally, even though I completely disagree with the sentiment. But this is also just a wholly unique take on Al Gore performance-wise too. It doesn't even remotely match what they had done earlier in the series.
Man Bear Pig doesn't care who you are or what you've done. Man Bear Pig simply wants to get you. I'm super serial.
And I think this once again highlights Matt and Trey's priorities here. They basically turned Al Gore into a cartoon character who is a comedic powerhouse. It is such a funny and silly performance. Trey actually talked a bit about how much they loved his characterization in the commentary.
And I just love Al Gore's character. He's just like, it's actually a really complex character because it's one of those that like you feel sorry for, but he's also the antagonist.
And they continued to talk for years about how much they loved their version of Al Gore as a character, character, finding a few excuses to bring him back. First, in the Imagination Land trilogy, which shows Man Bear Pig escaping from Imagination Land, and Gore successfully spearheading an effort to nuke our imaginations. Like, this just moves so far beyond reality, but it stems from the comedic aspects they set up for Gore prior to this. They even put him in a great side quest in the video game Stick of Truth, basically still up to the same old stuff. He recruits you to help hunt down MVP, and he's wildly paranoid about it. At one point, you actually have to fight him and his PowerPoint presentation, and then later he dresses up as Man Bear Pig and you have to fight that version of him. All very fun, all very silly, comedy prioritized. They even decided to really bring him back in season 22, and this time they sort of flipped the script on the commentary a little bit. Previously, they were really going in on Gore's fight to bring attention to climate change.
Because the original Man Bear Pig joke was that Man Bear Pig's not real, and that this dopey Al Gore guy is running around and trying to convince everybody. And obviously 15 years later, that hasn't aged that well.
So this time, they reveal that Man Bear Pig is actually real. I did a video on this years ago. This was this weird pseudo-apology to Al Gore, though they certainly do not change how he's characterized. In fact, this is maybe the most fun Al Gore ever is in the series. When the boys come to him for help after MVP shows up, he basically just holds the fact that he was right over their heads and demands that they apologize for the way they treated him.
We're sorry for making fun of you.
That didn't sound serial at all.
I particularly loved that he made them watch old footage of his career, basically making it feel like he's giving a PowerPoint presentation, not unlike the vibes of An Inconvenient Truth itself. He's just so petty about everything, and it's incredibly funny. But I think also, most interestingly, is that this doesn't align with how Gore actually reacted in real life to the apology episodes. He actually was really, really appreciative.
Honestly, I was so impressed. I don't know these guys, Matt and Trey, and I kind of thought they were nihilists of sorts, right? You know? But funny nihilists. And they all say, "Oh, we're so sorry, Al Gore. Man Bear Pig is real." I thought it was a hell of a statement by South Park, and I appreciated it a lot.
And again, I just think this highlights Matt and Trey's priorities. Obviously, in both the original Man Bear Pig episode and the serial duology, there is commentary at the core, both surrounding climate change, but they also use these things as a jumping off point to create comedic characters and funny scenarios. And I think, while they do always tend to have something to say, their priority is always comedy. If it isn't funny, they feel they've failed, and with Al Gore, even while flipping the commentary years later, they maintained the comedic persona of the character. Plus, now this clip of the actual Al Gore exists.
Man Bear Pig is real.
Okay, after that Al Gore detour, we've arrived at George W. Bush, who remains the president with the most number of South Park episodes airing during his tenure in office. And the way Matt and Trey treated W is kind of interesting because they definitely shifted gears in the midst of his tenure. And I think that shift is another thing that not only highlights Matt and Trey's tendencies when it comes to parody and comedy, but also parallels exactly what they've said in 2024. But before we talk about Bush on South Park, let's talk about the short-lived That's My Bush.
He's the president in residence, he's kind of in charge, he's got the whole country saying, "That's my Bush."
The thing about this show is that it also wasn't really rooted in a realistic portrayal of George W. Bush. It is an incredibly funny sitcom performance from Timothy Bottoms, even if the show itself is sort of funnier on paper than in execution. But because they mostly just assigned him the bumbling main character role in this half-family, half-workplace sitcom, it really just makes him look very stupid.
Warning, incoming missiles detected. Code red.
What the hell's that?
And for the first couple of South Park appearances, George W. was also seen as a bit dim and inept. In fact, the first appearance in the band episode Super Best Friends actually was a That's My Bush crossover. It showcased the entire cast, visually at least.
Mr. President, we can't let them all kill themselves. Well, we can't give them tax-exempt status either, Carl. Hey, George, what's going on?
For Bush's first term, he only had a few appearances and maintained this character design, which maybe looks a little closer to the Timothy Bottoms Bush than the actual Bush. His second appearance was in Ladder to Heaven, in which he has to convince the UN that Saddam Hussein is building weapons of mass destruction in heaven. This was obviously referencing the fact that the US invaded Iraq, making claims that Hussein was building weapons of mass destruction, which proved to be untrue and remains a pretty massive controversy in US history to this day. But man, it is hard to deny that South Park's implementation of this idea isn't perfect. Saddam Hussein was obviously a main character in the South Park movie and had since canonically been banished from hell to heaven. And so when the Iraq War began and these controversies became major headlines, South Park pretty much nailed it in terms of tying real-world commentary to their own lore and history.
And I was dumb enough to believe Saddam could actually be up there building bombs.
Of course, unlike Iraq, Saddam was building bombs in heaven, something they never really followed up, weirdly. And then the last appearance of George W. Bush during his first term was this quick cameo where he gets a makeover from the Queer Eye dudes. So during his first 4 years in office, genuinely very few appearances for George W. Bush. And then came the episode Douche and Turd, one of the most infamous South Park election episodes. This one doesn't feature Bush specifically, but the commentary is clear. The kids are forced to vote for a new school mascot, with the choices being a giant douche and a turd sandwich. Not subtle commentary, but it is commentary nonetheless.
This is the most important election of your life. Turd sandwich brings the hope for change.
And this really was just exactly how Matt and Trey felt about that election.
With the choices you were given, it just, what was the point? I honestly did not care which of those two people was president because I despised them both.
I think this is a sentiment people have related to more and more as time has gone on, but it is interesting to hear Trey say that he despised George W. Bush, because all things considered, for his second term, they didn't really portray him in the same dim, negative way. But I think there was also a different reason for this, and again, it's in regards to comedy. Matt and Trey are not shy about their sort of comedy snobbery. They were actually asked why they didn't lay into George W. Bush more in their film Team America, and this was Matt's response. If you want to see Bush bashing in America, you only have to walk about 10 feet to find it. Trey and I are always attracted to what other people aren't doing. Frankly, that wasn't the movie we wanted to make. And again, I think this really tracks. Particularly leading into that election, that sort of Bush's dumb comedy became very commonplace, and I think as they'd rather be comedic innovators, it's understandable that Matt and Trey saw this as a little bit hack. It's just what everybody else was doing, and I want you guys to keep this sentiment in mind later when we talk about 2024. And for Bush's South Park appearances after this, alongside a character design makeover, they kind of just built different comedic scenarios around him rather than lean into what everyone else was doing, which was just making him stupid. His first second term appearance was in Cartoon Wars, and they just gave him this very silly sequence with the Fox president.
Are you the network president? Yes, Mr. President. We need to discuss this Family Guy episode, Mr. President. Mr. President, my hands are tied.
In fact, they sort of flipped the script in these episodes, with Bush looking far more competent than he had previously or was in other satirical media at the time, and the media itself sort of plays the dumber role.
The Family Guy writing staff is protected by something called the First Amendment.
And what exactly is this First Amendment, Mr. President?
I think this was mostly a reflection of how Matt and Trey were feeling about the media in this exact moment due to their censorship woes. Bush's next appearance would be probably his most substantial in South Park history, and it's probably his funniest as well. Mystery of the Urinal Deuce is all about 9/11 conspiracists, particularly the ones who make the age-old claim Bush did 9/11. But the fun spin that South Park puts on this idea is that the real conspiracy is that while Bush did not do 9/11, he wants everybody to think he does, to make it look like the US government has far more control than it actually does, basically to make themselves feel threatening and powerful enough to do anything.
Really, we just rerouted them to Pennsylvania, then flew 2 military jets in the World Trade Center filled with more explosives and shot down all the witnesses.
I wish I could play this entire clip. It's too long, but it is very funny. Basically just laying out how absurdly complicated the reality of that kind of conspiracy would be. And this is definitely the one episode that sort of makes Bush just look like a full-on villain, completely antagonistic, attempting to showcase power and to control the minds of the people. Pretty different than his earlier appearances. Bush also makes a really brief appearance in The Snook, with Cartman trying to warn him about the nuke that's inside Hillary Clinton.
Huh? Who?
Look, I know you're not the biggest Hill Dog fan, but she is in great danger right now.
Hill Dog?
He's also got a little cameo when the government commended Randy for taking the biggest crap in the world.
Hey, look, Sharon, it's the president! Hey, Sharon!
Bush also had one last tiny cameo as a paparazzi trying to take photos of Britney Spears, along with basically everyone that has ever been on South Park in history. But that was his final appearance as president, and really his final appearance on the show. There is some actual archival footage of him in Al Gore's film presentation In Time to Get Cereal, but they never really used George W. Bush as a character or this animated character design ever again. And as I mentioned before, I think that the way they treated Bush and sort of held back on making fun of him has a lot more to do with Matt and Trey's own comedy standards. They didn't want to cover overly tread ground. They generally want their show to stand out. Stone actually talked about this one more time in an interview about the episode about last night. But mostly I'm tired of Bush jokes. I was tired of them about a year after he was elected. It's not a political thing. When is the last time you heard a good Bush joke that really made you laugh? It's just tiring, and it's been done. We like to find, for the most part, we try to find virgin territory to stamp around in and pee in. Bush has just been done. And again, I think this is an attitude you should keep in mind as we move into more modern eras. Okay, on to Obama.
Yeah, Obama! Change! It's change!
Barack Obama made his brief South Park debut as a candidate in the episode Britney's New Look, but he obviously made his proper debut in the infamous election episode About Last Night. Actually, an episode I just made an entire video about. But what made About Last Night unique is that they didn't really use any characteristics from the actual Barack Obama or his opponent John McCain, because they basically pasted an Ocean's 11 heist parody over the election episode. This is an incredibly funny story, largely because they chose to go all in on this becoming president to steal the Hope Diamond plotline, which again really prioritizes the comedic story over any sort of character judgment or political message. It shows once again where Matt and Trey's priorities tend to lie when it comes to a lot of these presidential caricatures. Of course, after the heist is successful, he changes his tune a little bit.
I've decided to hang it up. Maybe give this president thing a shot.
And much like George W. Bush, across the nearly 100 episodes that aired during Obama's 2 terms, they didn't utilize him all that often. And when they did, it wasn't like they were lampooning him or his policies. It was mostly just when it made sense to use the president for a story. There was some funny observational comedy, like after Kyle took on everyone in South Park's debt and became their economic messiah, he actually didn't get any of the credit.
The person we must thank every day for his amazing sacrifice. Barack Obama.
Sort of a commentary on the way Obama was put on a pedestal in the early days of his administration. But the episode that used Obama probably more than any other outside of About Last Night was the episode Sexual Healing, which we already covered from Bill Clinton's perspective. In this one, they sort of just have Obama lead the charge in the men's sort of phony fight against sex addiction. This one just sort of has everyone appear woefully ignorant as to why men with money and success tend to get caught cheating.
So we must keep our nation's youth away from money and success.
This one feels very in line with Mystery of the Urinal Deuce, where they sort of just use the president as a government figurehead for a bigger story. They blame sex addiction on an alien crashing at Roswell. They go in to kill the quote-unquote alien wizard, which is really just a dude all dressed up. As I mentioned in the Clinton section, it's basically just a means for men to avoid any responsibility for their actions.
The wizard alien is dead. Sex addiction is no more.
The episode Funny Bot went pretty hard at Tyler Perry in his movies, revealing that Obama is a huge fan, even planning to watch his films with his family as the world ends.
I know, it's embarrassing, but I simply can't help myself.
He does also call Perry the greatest threat to mankind at the end of the episode, so there's that. There's also a silly little moment at the end of Asperger's when Duck President is swapped back out for Obama, but this was more about Stan's view of the world shifting than any actual commentary about Obama. I do think that in general, Obama was mentioned more in his era than Bush was in his. In the episode Poor and Stupid, NASCAR Cartman, or NASCartman, criticizes Obama.
I don't know about y'all, but this President Obama is pissing me off. So I'm gonna do some dip and speak my mind.
Similarly, he did this in 1%. For one, he thought that Obama himself created the presidential fitness test, which is pretty funny. And he also blames all of his own problems on Obama.
Don't you get it, Mom? People voted for Obama, so now that everything sucks, they have to blame me!
The big twist of this episode was, of course, that Cartman was quite literally doing all of these things to himself. He also made a brief non-speaking appearance clapping for Randy's incredibly sarcastic speech against football, pushing Sarcastball into the national conversation. And then there's the 2012 election episode, Obama Wins, which is actually a pretty interesting relic in retrospect. This episode sort of tied the election to the then news that Star Wars had been sold to Disney. And though Obama is a big piece of this story, he's not really the main character like we saw in About Last Night.
We didn't want it to center around the president again. We wanted to just be our characters.
Right. But what's really interesting in this story is about Cartman stealing ballots from swing states to change the election results. This was an idea that was rightfully presented as absurd, and it came 8 years before the claims of a stolen election were eventually made by a candidate. Though the web of deceit is very funny in this one, Obama conspires with the Chinese, who hire Cartman to steal the ballots, all because the Chinese want to own and protect Star Wars from Disney.
I told you China would get the rights to Star Wars from Disney as long as my presidency was secure.
But after this, Obama wasn't used nearly at all for his entire second term, with only one more small appearance in season 19 leading up to the 2016 election. He invites Kyle to the White House to commend him for his speech on Caitlyn Jenner and even surprises him with a ride back to South Park with Caitlyn Jenner. And that was Obama's final appearance during his tenure as president. He did have one final cameo in the vaccination special as one of the adrenochrome drinking elites who kidnaps children, an episode that was obviously pointing out how ridiculously absurd these claims were, but I guess when you're someone who thinks people drink children's blood to remain youthful, you're probably exactly the type of person who would point to a South Park parody as proof of this, which is incredibly embarrassing. Once again, Obama tends to be a presidential character in South Park who sort of molds as needed to the story, not unlike George W. Bush. There are minimal references to their policies, and they're used for various stories as seen fit. And frankly, this is also how they used Bill Clinton, even though they specifically focused on his sexual promiscuity within the stories they fit him into. But I think through 3 presidents and Al Gore, you've got to see this pattern emerging. There is a focus on comedic traits and narratives with some references to policies and actual politics. This was mostly the way they used these characters for most of their run, and Obama was no different.
Boom, baby! She's such a turd sandwich.
So I think we have to take one more little detour because this is a character that has been used a decent amount in South Park history and obviously is at the center of the entire season 20 debacle. Hillary Clinton has made brief appearances across most of the history of the series, though at first she was just sort of used in these running newscast gags where they would kind of just fully insult her.
But Hillary Clinton's ass just keeps getting bigger.
Her first real appearance was in season 11's The Snook when she was campaigning for president back in 2008. This entire episode is a 24 parody where Cartman needs to warn everyone and try to disarm a nuke that has been placed, well, inside Hillary Clinton. I do think within the brief moments of Hillary characterization, they sort of paint her as a phony. We can see how her accent changes entirely when she's talking to her people versus when she's talking to the rally goers.
No, I will not be bullied by terrorist threats. Because it is in towns like South Park that you find the true America.
Hillary makes a couple more small, irrelevant appearances after this, but she really shows back up on the scene in season 19 while debating Garrison leading into the 2016 election. This sequence feels a bit more about Garrison's characterization than anything, but they do show Hillary as a calm debater who is continually upstaged by Garrison's antics.
But I believe there are several things that we can...
No, you shut the hell up! You've got a dumpy butt and 7 chins. Syrian refugees are all terrorists.
And this more or less leads into the dynamic we see in season 20 as well, which is of course widely considered to be a pretty big disaster. By Matt and Trey themselves even.
Because season 20 was kind of a nightmare. It was probably the hardest season we've ever tried to do.
Obviously, we'll talk a ton about this in the next section, but a lot of season 20 is basically spent with characters exasperated by the fact that Hillary is absolutely blowing her campaign against Garrison. Pretty real. Even when Garrison is trying to throw the election and is telling people not to vote for him, Hillary blows it.
She's actually capable of running this country.
My opponent is a liar and he cannot be trusted. No!
Oh my God, she is such a turd sandwich.
Even though they clearly anticipated a Clinton victory in the 2016 election and it messed up their entire plan for the season, it's also pretty clear that Matt and Trey don't think much of Hillary. They are definitely not fans of the Clintons. And honestly, her whole little arc on South Park sort of ends with a whimper because of the failed election prediction. Her last appearance shows her sending Gerald to Denmark to try and heist the troll trace technology and stop Garrison from getting into office, but we just never see her again after this. Honestly, there is a lot of really interesting ideas to really dissect in terms of season 20 and how and why it went wrong, and I do plan to do that in a whole separate video, but largely it does come down to the election upset. Hillary also made one last appearance, again as an adrenochrome drinking elite in the vaccination special, just like Obama, and again, if you think they were pointing to a real thing that happens and not satirizing conspiracies, please seek help.
We should have put up a goddamn wall.
Obviously, this is the most unique section in this entire video because Trump was not portrayed in the same way previous presidents had been. Though there was one really brief appearance of actual Donald Trump in season 5's The Entity, ironically enough coming to South Park to potentially invest in Garrison's invention. But Trump running for president coincided with season 19 of South Park, which was basically their second attempt at a serialized light season. And there is a really clear theme to season 19 that I still find really interesting and effective. Basically, South Park reconciling with its own history and its identity as this sort of relic from the 90s that has survived for a couple of decades. They bring in PC Principal, this PC character who questions everything about how things are run, and so they start to update the town locations, the town gets their first gay kids, and they kind of interrogate what about the show has evolved and what hasn't. And they chose to use Garrison as the sort of holdout character who pushes back against things changing, since he is this sort of important, long-standing institutional character from when the show began. But again, this coincided with Trump's run for president.
Oh, I guess we got to do a Trump show because everyone's talking about Trump, even though we were kind of like, man, that sounds really easy and it sounds really base, and we're not going to give him the satisfaction of being in the show. We'll make one of our characters Trump-like.
And so, because of how they had been utilizing Garrison as this sort of holdout who is hearkening back to the quote-unquote good old days, they figured he was a pretty perfect choice to become their Trump stand-in. Garrison runs on a very specific, egregiously awful campaign promise that I don't think I can actually even put in this video, and he successfully carries out that promise against this Canadian version of Trump that drove Canadians out of Canada and into South Park. That's the sort of other aspect of this. There was this Canadian version of Trump, and then there's this sort of transitionary moment where Garrison kind of becomes their Trump stand-in by sort of usurping the Canadian version. But the problem was that Matt and Trey didn't really expect this to go all that much further than it did here. For the last few episodes of season 19, they basically bring Garrison back to South Park to help wrap up the big season-long conflict, and it's pretty clear that he's being used more as Garrison here than Trump. And I think that's sort of the core issue with the Garrison-Trump of it all moving forward, especially as he got closer and closer to the White House.
We were kind of stuck with the Mr. Garrison thing. We had done this whole thing making Garrison Trump, thinking, oh, that's our Trump show and we won't ever have to do it again. And we started this season going, oh, Garrison can't just come back and be teacher.
The curveball of Trump's continued 2016 success and eventual victory, after they had already committed to Mr. Garrison acting as their Trump stand-in, forced them to fundamentally change how they approach the president as a character.
Trump just kept taking over everything, and we had to sort of like move with it. We were hoping that by November it was going to be all about Garrison coming back to try to be a teacher again, and
having to make amends for being such a dick.
For the first half of season 20, you really see Garrison in there, panicking as he realizes that he might actually have to deal with the reality of being president, desperately trying to throw the election so that he climbs out of the grave he dug for himself. And then there's a clear shift after Trump won the election, sort of emphasized by this transition scene where Garrison receives his Trump hairpiece a la Darth Vader. The big struggle is that Mr. Garrison is also an existing South Park character who has 19 years of history on the series before he became their Donald Trump. So obviously, with Garrison having been a huge part of the show for the entire duration of its existence, that means they're far more likely to use him as a character than they were other presidents. And it's obviously going to change how that character is used compared to previous presidents as well. They had to both reconcile the character that came before and the modern commentary or current events being parodied from the Trump administration. Obviously, Garrison was used as Trump pretty heavily for the back half of season 20 to wrap up the whole Troll Trey storyline, and then season 21 uses him for about 5 of 10 episodes, but the ways they use him really vary. He's actually not even in the episode Put It Down, but his tweets are, and those tweets are making Tweek's life awful as he basically pits North Korea against this poor child, an obvious reference to when Trump was tweeting inflammatory statements aimed at North Korea and Kim Jong-un. But then an episode like Sons of Witches, which is pretty easily my favorite of that season, they bring Garrison in simply because he is Garrison, not really as Trump at all. In this one, all of the guys in town are celebrating Jack and Crack Witch Week, until one of them actually summons the spirit of a witch and starts kidnapping kids. Garrison actually comes to town and kind kind of saves everybody.
You're ruining the party for everyone, Chip. I'm here to take you out.
Trey talked a bit about the reaction to this, with people feeling like they made Trump look heroic, and I think his explanation here really highlights exactly the point I'm making.
A, it's not Trump, it's Mr. Garrison. B, he's a witch.
He's dressed like a witch.
I think instances like this showcase the exact struggle I mentioned. Matt and Trey ended up using Trump on the show far more than they ever really wanted to, simply because he is also Mr. Garrison. And even then, they used him less and less further into his term that they got. He's a big part of the end of season 21. They sort of meld Garrison's personality with Trump's and then showcased his sort of abusive relationships towards the GOP leaders. Then he nukes Canada in this big pseudo sequel, The Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, before basically becoming a Pennywise-like monster in the season finale It parody. And then he only made 3 more appearances as the Trump version of Garrison across seasons 22, 23, and 24. And even during season 21, Matt and Trey were feeling the Trump fatigue.
It was just like, we were so bored of ripping on Trump.
And I think if you look at all of the comments they made about Bush earlier in their careers and how their priority is trying to tread new ground comedically, you can fully understand exactly why they started moving away. For one, it wasn't their usual MO, but also, everybody was doing the same Trump-centric comedy. All of the late night shows were riddled with it. SNL had Alec Baldwin on call to play him. There was literally an entire animated show called Our Cartoon President. It was a little exhausting. And the fact that they used Garrison Trump so often in seasons 20 and 21 sort of shifted people's perceptions of how South Park handles presidents, because it was an entirely different circumstance. Yeah, South Park has always made fun of presidents or used them in comedic ways, but not nearly as often as people seem to think they do. And the only real reason they did so often here was because he had melded into Garrison, a hugely important character. And I think this is further evidenced when you look at the vaccination special. They were obviously so eager to get Garrison back into his usual role. Hell, even the most recent little Garrison Trump appearance in season 26 Spring Break is such a character-focused episode that again treads entirely new ground comedically. The whole idea is that Garrison is basically relapsing into rallying like it's a drug addiction. It's such a funny concept, and they use that relapse storyline to tell an emotional story about Garrison and his boyfriend Rick.
I don't deserve another chance. You have been wronged. And the only person who deserves retribution is me.
And it's not like South Park didn't have any commentary to make about Trump. The entire sort of theme and message of season 20 was about the way our culture has become sort of nostalgia brain, and how the we miss the good old days attitude was attracting people to Trump's regressive rhetoric. That season was having sort of internal conversations about provocateurs and what it means when those people gain this kind of notoriety and influence. But I think it's just very clear that Garrison Trump is the outlier in terms of South Park's presidential parody tendencies, which I guess leads us to the final section.
Joe Biden caused a recession, so they took my job.
Okay, obviously this is going to be a shorter section because the only time Biden has ever been depicted in South Park is actually in a deleted scene from About Last Night. He didn't even have any dialogue, and he's only been mentioned a couple of times outside of that. And understandably, this annoys people, especially people who feel like South Park refused to actually parody him during his term as president. But I also think the context of that term is pretty important. And one of the most important pieces of context is just the number of opportunities to parody, which was far less than any other president in history. Bill Clinton's presidential tenure contained 59 South Park episodes in a movie. Bush's contained a whopping 119 episodes. Obama's a massive 95 episodes. Trump's one term only contained 35 episodes, but that is still 15 more than Biden's term, during which South Park had a mere 20 episodes or specials. And because they had made Garrison their Trump surrogate, Matt and Trey definitely used him in far more stories than I think they ever really meant to. So the juxtaposition of how often they seem to use Trump versus how little they used Biden rubs people the wrong way. But it was also so clear how sick they were of the political commentary and election cycles taking over these seasons. So many fans have wanted them to get back to the more kid-focused adventures, and even in the midst of the Garrison Trump seasons, Matt and Trey were expressing this desire as well.
I think I can agree with a lot of fans where I'm just excited to get back to a lot of Awesome and Christmas critters.
And when you look at the handful handful of stories they've done in seasons 25, 26, and on Paramount, it does feel like they moved further away from the overt portrayal of American politics, away from Tegrity Farms, and back to more basic kid-focused stories with social commentary baked in. Hell, they pointedly did not cover the 2020 election, which makes me wonder why people are so upset that they've decided to also not cover the 2024 election. When people claim that they must be scared to cover Biden or Harris, I can't help but feel a little embarrassed for that point of view. Through their words and tendencies over the entire history of the show, it just seems clear that they aren't afraid to cover any topic, and they've always prioritized what they think is funniest. They are, most of the time, comedically motivated. If Trump wins the 2024 election, I wouldn't be surprised if they wrote in some sort of way to separate the Garrison and Trump personas so that they can actually get their important character back. If Harris wins, I would be willing to bet she'll be used very occasionally in the exact same ways we saw George W. Bush or Obama be used. Everything is right there if you look through the show's history. Okay, vote if you haven't. Bye.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.